A gunshot echoed through the valley as Temperance Miller ducked behind the splintered remains of her family's wagon, clutching her father's old revolver with trembling hands. The year was 1875, and the Wyoming Territory had proven as unforgiving as the rumors suggested. 3 days since outlaws had ambushed their wagon train, leaving her the sole survivor, and still they hunted her through the rugged landscape. "I know you're out there, little lady," a gruff voice called from beyond the ridge. "Ain't nowhere to run to." Temperance steadied her breathing, the way her father had taught her. At 22, she'd never imagined she'd be fighting for her life in this wild country. She'd left St. Louis full of dreams about the new teaching position awaiting her in Oregon Territory. Now those dreams seemed as distant as the stars. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart race. She raised the revolver, knowing she had just 2 bullets remaining. The rider crested the hill, silhouetted against the setting sun, but to her surprise, he wasn't one of the bandits who'd been tracking her. "Hello, the wagon," the stranger called, his voice deep but gentle. "I mean no harm." Temperance kept her gun trained on him as he approached. He rode a magnificent chestnut stallion, his tall frame relaxed in the saddle. A worn leather hat shadowed his features, but she could make out a strong jawline covered in several days' worth of stubble. "Stay back," she warned, her voice stronger than she felt. "I've had my fill of strangers these past days." The man reined his horse to a stop, raising both hands to show they were empty. "Name's Clive Quincy, madam. I tracked some unsavory characters to this valley. Judging by your situation, I'm guessing they found you first." Temperance swallowed hard. "They killed everyone. The entire wagon train. I only escaped because—" Her voice broke as the memories rushed back. Clive dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with kind eyes that contrasted with the weathered lines on his face. "They're still after me," she whispered. "Not anymore," he said, his expression grim. "I dealt with them about 2 miles back, found their camp end." He didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear enough. Relief washed over her so suddenly that Temperance nearly collapsed. 3 days of constant vigilance, of hiding and running, had drained her completely. "I'm heading to Pine Creek," Clive said. "It's about a day's ride from here." "You're welcome to ride with me." Temperance nodded, too exhausted to argue or question her good fortune. As she stood, her legs buckled beneath her, and Clive caught her before she hit the ground. "When's the last time you had food or proper rest, Miss Miller?" "Temperance Miller." "And I don't rightly remember." Clive frowned, concern evident in his eyes. "Let's make camp for the night. You need food and sleep before we travel further." As darkness fell, they made a small, sheltered fire in a nearby hollow. Clive produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, along with a flask of water. Temperance ate slowly, watching him across the flames. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to the wilderness, his actions efficient and purposeful. "What brings you to Wyoming Territory, Miss Miller?" he asked, breaking the silence. "I was to be a school teacher in Oregon." She stared into the fire. "My father died last winter and there was nothing left for me in St. Louis." Clive nodded. "Teaching's good, honest work. What about you, Mr. Quincy? Are you a lawman?" A shadow crossed his face. "Not officially. I track men who need finding, sometimes for the law, sometimes for families seeking justice." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Those men I dealt with have been terrorizing settlements across 3 territories. They won't harm anyone else now." As the fire burned low, Temperance fought to keep her eyes open, but exhaustion was winning. Clive noticed and spread his bedroll near the fire. "You take this, I'll keep watch." "You don't have to, I insist, Miss Miller. You need proper rest." Too tired to argue, Temperance accepted his offer. As she settled onto the bedroll, she murmured, "Thank you for finding me, Mr. Quincy." She was asleep before he could respond. When dawn broke, Temperance awakened to find Clive's coat draped over her for extra warmth. He sat a few feet away, his rifle across his knees, looking as alert as if he'd slept a full night. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, sitting up. "Enough," he replied with a small smile. "There's coffee if you'd like some before we ride." As they traveled toward Pine Creek, Temperance learned more about her rescuer. Clive had been a Union soldier during the war, then worked cattle drives before taking up his current profession. He spoke little of family, suggesting there wasn't much to tell. Pine Creek proved to be a small but growing settlement, a single street of wooden buildings with a general store, saloon, and a dozen homes spreading outward. People regarded them curiously as they rode in, and Temperance suddenly became aware of her disheveled appearance. "The town has a small boarding house," Clive said as they stopped in front of a two-story building. "Mrs. Holloway runs it. She's a good woman who'll help get you situated." Temperance felt a pang of apprehension. "You're leaving." "I need to report to the territorial marshal in Laramie about those bandits, but I'll return in a few days. Make sure you're settling in." He hesitated. "If you wish to continue to Oregon afterward, I can help arrange safe passage." Before she could respond, a plump woman in an apron emerged from the boarding house, her eyes widening at the sight of them. "Clive Quincy, land's sake, it's been months." The woman hurried forward, then stopped short when she noticed Temperance. "And who might this be?" "Mrs. Holloway, this is Miss Temperance Miller. She survived an attack on her wagon train and needs lodging while she recovers." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened immediately. "You poor dear, come inside right away. We'll get you cleaned up and fed properly." With reluctance, Temperance dismounted and turned to Clive. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed, Miss Miller. I'll check on you when I return." She watched him ride away, feeling strangely bereft despite having known him for barely a day. Mrs. Holloway gently guided her inside, clucking sympathetically about her ordeal. The next week passed in a haze for Temperance. Mrs. Holloway provided clothes, food, and motherly concern in abundance. The town doctor examined her and pronounced her physically sound if undernourished and exhausted. The townspeople, learning of her teaching background, began suggesting she might stay in Pine Creek, which lacked a proper school. But Temperance found herself watching the road for Clive's return, despite her best efforts not to. When he finally rode into town 8 days later, she was sitting on the boarding house porch and stood so quickly she nearly knocked over her chair. He looked trail-worn but smiled when he saw her. "Miss Miller, you're looking well, Mr. Quincy. I was beginning to wonder if you'd return." His expression turned apologetic. "Got delayed in Laramie, had to give testimony about those bandits to a federal judge." That evening, they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. Temperance had spent the day showing Clive around Pine Creek, introducing him to the people who had welcomed her so warmly. "The town council asked if I'd consider staying to teach," she said. "They've offered to build a proper schoolhouse by winter." Clive nodded, his expression unreadable. "Pine Creek's growing. A school would serve it well." He paused. "Will you accept?" Temperance hesitated. "I'm not certain. What awaits me in Oregon is a stranger's arrangement. Here, at least, I've found kindness." She glanced at him. "What about you? Will you continue your work?" "It's what I know," he said simply. "Is there nothing that would make you consider settling somewhere?" She couldn't quite meet his eyes as she asked. Clive was silent for a long moment. "There might be, but my life isn't suited for putting down roots." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but something had changed between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities neither was ready to voice. As summer progressed, Temperance agreed to stay in Pine Creek, at least temporarily. The town built her a small cabin near the planned schoolhouse site, and she began teaching a handful of children in the church while construction progressed. Clive came and went, his visits to Pine Creek becoming more frequent and his departures increasingly reluctant. On a warm August evening, Temperance sat on her new cabin's porch, reading letters from prospective students' parents. She heard the now familiar sound of Clive's horse approaching and looked up with a smile that faltered when she saw his grim expression. "What's wrong?" she asked as he dismounted. "Trouble's brewing." A man named Jackson and his gang have been robbing stagecoaches between here and Cheyenne. The marshal asked for my help tracking them. That sounds dangerous, Temperance said, her chest tightening with fear. It's what I do. He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. I'll be gone a couple of weeks, maybe longer, Temperance nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. In the month since their first meeting, Clive had become more than just her rescuer. He was her closest friend in Pine Creek, and perhaps something more, though neither had spoken of it directly. Be careful, she said softly. Clive stepped closer. Temperance. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sent a flutter through her chest. I want you to know, if anything happens, don't, she interrupted. You'll come back, you always do. He searched her face for a moment, then nodded. I'll come back. True to his word, Clive returned 3 weeks later, sporting a healing gash along his left forearm, but otherwise unharmed. The town welcomed him as a hero when word spread that he'd been instrumental in capturing the Jackson gang. That night they walked along Pine Creek's edge, the autumn air crisp under a blanket of stars. The schoolhouse is nearly finished, Temperance said. We'll have the dedication next week. It looks fine, Clive agreed. The children are fortunate to have you, she glanced at him. Will you stay for the dedication? He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about staying longer, actually. Temperance's heart skipped. Oh, the marshal offered me a deputy position here in Pine Creek. With the railroad coming through next year, they expect the town to grow considerably. That would mean putting down roots, she said carefully. Clive stopped walking and turned to face her. I've spent years drifting, Temperance, never staying anywhere long enough to. He trailed off, looking uncertain for the first time since she'd known him. Long enough to what? She prompted gently. To find something worth staying for. His eyes held hers. Until now. The kiss that followed was gentle, almost hesitant, but it sealed something between them that had been building since that first meeting by her broken wagon. As winter descended on Pine Creek, Clive took the deputy position and built a small cabin of his own at the edge of town. He and Temperance were often seen together, and though no formal announcement was made, the townsfolk nodded knowingly when they passed. On Christmas Eve, a blizzard swept through the valley, blanketing Pine Creek in deep snow. Temperance hosted a small gathering for those who couldn't travel to be with family Clive, Mrs. Holloway, the town doctor, and a few others. After the guests departed, Clive lingered, helping clean up while the storm raged outside. You'll never make it back to your cabin in this, Temperance said, peering out at the swirling snow. The drifts are taller than a man already. I've weathered worse, he said, but without conviction. Don't be foolish, Clive. You can take the spare room. He nodded gratefully, and they spent the evening by the fire, sharing stories of Christmases past. Temperance spoke of her father, a kind but stern man who'd read from the Bible every Christmas morning. Clive, surprisingly, revealed memories of a large family gathering in Missouri before the war had scattered his brothers to the winds. Do you ever write to them? She asked. Not for years, he admitted. After what I saw and did in the war, I didn't think I deserved their welcome. Temperance reached for his hand. People change, Clive. You've changed since I met you. Because of you, he said simply. The firelight cast a warm glow across his features as he looked at her with such tenderness that Temperance felt her breath catch. When he kissed her this time, there was nothing hesitant about it. Spring arrived in a riot of wildflowers, transforming the valley. The schoolhouse bustled with 20 students, and Pine Creek had nearly doubled in size with the promise of the railroad bringing even more growth. Clive had proven himself an excellent deputy, fair but firm with the occasional troublemakers who passed through. On a Sunday afternoon in May, Clive suggested a picnic by the creek. They rode to a secluded spot where cottonwoods provided shade and the water bubbled over smooth stones. I've been thinking, Clive said as they sat on a blanket after their meal. A dangerous pastime, Temperance teased. He smiled. Perhaps I've been thinking about the future, about permanence. Her heart quickened. Have you? I never expected to want a settled life. But then I found you by that broken wagon and everything changed." He took her hand. "I love you, Temperance Miller. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears welled in her eyes. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Deputy Quincy?" "I am." He produced a small ring from his pocket, a simple band with a modest pearl. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will." Their wedding was held in June, with the entire town in attendance. Mrs. Holloway cried throughout the ceremony, and even the territorial marshal rode in for the occasion. As Temperance and Clive exchanged vows, she marveled at the journey that had brought her here from terror and loss to love and belonging. That summer, they built an addition to Temperance's cabin, creating a proper home with room for the family they hoped to have. Clive continued as deputy while also helping establish the town's first proper livery stable. Temperance's school flourished, and she started an evening class for adults who wished to improve their reading and writing. Their first challenge as a married couple came in the fall, when a group of cattle rustlers began targeting nearby ranches. Clive rode out with a posse and was gone for nearly 2 weeks. Each night, Temperance stood on the porch, scanning the horizon for his return, remembering all too vividly the dangers that lurked in the territory. When he finally rode home, dusty and exhausted but unharmed, she ran to meet him, not caring who might see their embrace. "I was so afraid," she whispered against his chest. "I promised I'd come back," he reminded her. "I'll always come back to you." Winter brought heavy snows again, but their home remained warm and secure. On the coldest evenings, they would sit by the fire reading to each other from Temperance's collection of books. Sometimes Clive would play harmonica while she mended clothing or prepared lessons for her students. It was on such an evening, with the wind howling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, that Temperance shared her news. "Clive," she said, setting aside her mending, "I visited Dr. Warren today." He looked up, instantly alert. "Are you ill?" She shook her head, a smile spreading across her face. "Not ill. I'm going to have a baby, in early summer." The joy that transformed his features was something she would remember all her days. He crossed the room in 2 strides, gathering her into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." As her pregnancy progressed, Temperance continued teaching, though the town council hired an assistant to help with the more energetic children. Clive became even more protective, checking on her between his rounds and building a cradle with his own hands. The railroad finally reached Pine Creek that spring, bringing with it new settlers, businesses, and opportunities. The town was growing faster than anyone had predicted, and with growth came new challenges. Clive's duties increased, but he never failed to make time for Temperance. On a sweltering July evening, after a particularly long day of teaching summer sessions, Temperance felt the first pains. She sent word to Clive and the midwife, then prepared herself for what was to come. The labor lasted through the night, with Clive a constant presence, his steady voice encouraging her through each difficult moment. As dawn broke over the mountains, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to both parents' eyes. "She's perfect," Clive whispered, cradling the tiny bundle in his large hands as if she might break. "What shall we call her?" Temperance asked, exhausted but radiant. Clive considered the small face, already showing a determined expression that reminded him of her mother. "How about Hope?" "Because that's what she is, all our hopes for the future." "Hope," Temperance agreed. "Hope Quincy." The years that followed brought changes to Pine Creek and to their family. A second child, a son they named James, arrived 2 years after Hope. The railroad brought prosperity, and with it, more families seeking education for their children. The original schoolhouse was expanded, and Temperance was named principal of what was now a proper school with 3 teachers. Clive eventually became town marshal when the previous one retired, a position that suited his fair-minded approach to justice and his protective nature. The wild days of the territory were gradually giving way to more settled times, though occasional reminders of the frontier's dangers still arose. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Clive surprised Temperance with a trip to St. Louis, her first return since leaving for Oregon so many years before. They visited her father's grave, and Temperance felt a sense of completion as she introduced Clive and their children to the place where she'd grown up. "You ever regret not making it to Oregon?" Clive asked as they stood on the banks of the Mississippi, watching riverboats pass. Temperance shook her head. "How could I? If I'd reached Oregon, I would never have met you. Everything that happened, even the terrible attack on the wagon train, led me to where I was meant to be." Upon their return to Pine Creek, now a proper town with a mayor and town council, they found their lives busier than ever. Hope, at 9, showed her mother's intelligence and her father's determination. 7-year-old James had Clive's way with horses and spent every spare moment at the stables. The autumn of 1888 brought an early cold spell, with frost covering the ground by mid-September. Temperance found herself more tired than usual, falling asleep in her chair by the fire most evenings while checking student compositions. One night, Clive returned from his rounds to find her slumped in her favorite chair, papers scattered across her lap, the fire burning low. For a moment, the sight alarmed him. Too many memories of finding people who would never wake again during his years of tracking outlaws. But the gentle rise and fall of her chest reassured him. He carefully gathered the papers and set them on the side table, then draped a warm blanket over her. Kneeling beside the chair, he studied her face, the lines that had formed around her eyes from years of laughter, the strand of silver that had appeared in her hair last winter. "I promise you peace, my love," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead, "for all the days we have." Temperance stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. "Clive, I'm sorry, I must have dozed off again." "No need for sorry," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You work harder than anyone I know." She caught his hand, pressing it to her cheek. "I was dreaming about the day we met. How frightened I was, and then you appeared like something out of a dime novel," he chuckled. "Hardly that dramatic." "It was to me." Her eyes, still drowsy, held his. "You saved more than my life that day, Clive. You saved my future." "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "Now let's get you to bed. The compositions will wait until morning." As he helped her up, supporting her with an arm around her waist, Temperance leaned into him with a contented sigh. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the home they'd built together. But inside, all was warm and secure. The following spring, they celebrated as Pine Creek was officially incorporated as a town. A photographer came through and took a portrait of the entire community, with Clive and Temperance as marshal and school principal prominently placed in the center, their children standing proudly beside them. When the photograph was developed and copies distributed, Temperance framed theirs and hung it in their parlor. Often, she would pause before it, marveling at how far they had come from that desperate meeting in the wilderness. On warm evenings, they still sat on their porch, watching Hope and James play with the other town children. Sometimes, Clive would point to the distant mountains where he'd found her all those years ago. "Remember when you asked if there was anything that would make me consider settling down?" He said one such evening, his hand covering hers on the porch railing. Temperance nodded. "You said there might be." "I was already falling in love with you," he admitted, "but I was afraid to acknowledge it, even to myself." "And now?" she asked, though she knew the answer. Clive pulled her close, resting his chin on the top of her head as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues. "Now I know it was always meant to be. That broken wagon was the beginning of our story, not the end of yours." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they remained on the porch, content in the life they'd built together, a life that had begun with a desperate meeting and a simple act of kindness when a cowboy had covered a sleeping widow and promised her peace.